I'm honored to be here today talking to the group of people that is present here, as well as all the other people that are listening to this presentation online. So as you said, the title of this presentation is A Right to Repair for a Post-Growth Society, Controversies, Opportunities and Challenges. Although I think probably the title is a little bit ambitious and I'm not going to cover so much ground today. And the reason is that what I will be presenting today is part of an ongoing research project. Okay, so this is at a very early stage. I joined the Post-Growth Innovation Lab in September, and my research as part of the Post-Growth Innovation Lab is concerned with the right to repair. I'm trying to think, as you know, like the Post-Growth Innovation Lab is interested in questions of technology, science and innovation, and how technology and science and innovation can be rethought and reimagined for a post-growth transition. So as part of this group, my specific agenda is focused on the right to repair, right? And as I said, this is work in progress. So this research that I'm going to be conducting within the next years is divided into three sort of levels of analysis. So these three levels of analysis is the sort of approach I'm using to try to understand what is this thing that we call the right to repair and how can we criticize some of the versions of it and provide alternatives. So the first level of analysis is to look at the policy regulatory framework of, which is associated with the promotion of the right to repair. And I'm doing this with the purpose of showing the limitations of this top-down approach and how it can be seen as a little bit conservative in terms of making the radical transformations that are required if we want to advance towards a post-growth society. And the focus of this presentation will be mainly on this first level of analysis, right? Policy and regulatory responses within the EU. After that, I'm going to be asking and investigating what are the views on the right to repair that are conceived by technology activists and grassroots organizations that are working on the right to repair. So I'm going to be doing the opposite move. I'm going to be looking at the bottom up, right? So how technology activists imagine the right to repair. And finally, the final part of my research will be about bringing in some post-growth and degrowth theory in order to analyze these tensions and contradictions and try to elucidate how we can think about the right to repair for a post-growth society. So my background is in marketing. So this is the first time that I engage with repair, right? I typically have, or in the past I've studied consumption and consumer activism. So just to give you an overview of where my background, my theoretical background is coming from, I basically work with three big bodies of literature. One is science and technology studies, which is also known as the sociology of technology. The second pillar of my work is critical marketing and transformative consumer research. So basically it's the idea that within marketing is not only should be studied as a managerial function, but also it should be studied as a powerful force that is shaping society and should have the concern of consumers as well as the well-being of the planet as a whole in mind. And finally, I'm working also by bringing in some theory from degrowth and post-growth, which is about being critical of this idea that only by pursuing endless or infinite economic growth we can solve all this sort of social and ecological problems that we are facing. So that's enough about my background. So I wanted to start with a reflection. I don't know whether you've read this book. This is a wonderful book by Alan Weisman. It was published, I think, in 2007. It's called The World Without Us. So what Alan Weisman did in this book is that he tried to imagine what would happen if the last human being would disappear from Earth, right? And in order to investigate that hypothetical future, he went on to ask experts like engineers, archaeologists, scientists. So what will happen with the world if humans would vanish tomorrow? And he came up with some very interesting conclusions. So basically he concluded that in less than 500 years, megalopolis such as New York or London will be completely annihilated. All visible infrastructure will be covered by forests. Buildings, roads and pavements will be destroyed, and underground systems would have collapsed 300 years earlier than that, right? And then in contrast we have this. The great pyramids of Egypt built 4,500 years ago, which are still standing. So I suppose this reflection is helping me to think when has our civilization given up on durability, and when has or why have we started to normalize the idea of waste? Because waste, if we want to understand the right to repair and why we are interested in the right to repair, which I'm going to define later in the talk, we need to start from the problem of e-waste, of electronic waste. So according to the latest report by the United Nations Global E-Waste Monitor, the world is on track of producing, well, in 2019 is the last record, we produced 43.6 metric tons of e-waste. And at the time it was projected that by 2021 we will be producing 57 million, so last year. Of course, these figures are hard to sometimes get a sense of because they're really big. But to give you an idea, 57 million metric tons of electronic waste will be the equivalent to the Great Wall of China, right? So that is produced annually, or that was produced only in 2021. And another thing that is very interesting from this trend is that the amount of e-waste that we are producing is projected to double every 16 years. I don't know where you were 16 years ago, but imagine the amount only every 16 years we are doubling the amount of e-waste that, or not exactly, but almost doubling the amount of e-waste that we are producing as a whole, globally. There is also this new research that came up, which is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, where they use this framework of planetary boundaries. And one of the new additions is this new planetary boundary that they call novel entities. So the novel entities boundary, which we have exceeded already, as you can see in the slide, is one that represents all these entities that are novel in a geological sense. So plastic, toxic chemicals, etc., which are threatening the integrity of Earth systems and processes. And as you can see, we have already exceeded this new planetary boundary, and these novel entities are also very much related to e-waste, right? Not exclusively. Of course, when we talk about e-waste in global terms, it can be a little bit misleading because there is a very uneven distribution of how e-waste is being produced here. So we cannot think about it as a unifying whole. We also need to look at the differences. So if you look at per capita production of e-waste, you will see that there are huge differences between the high-income countries and the lower-income ones. Okay, I don't want to go into the detail here, but just wanted to highlight that it's not only that globally we are producing more e-waste, but also we need to take into account that it is the global north, or the countries that we associate with the global north, that are the main producers of these e-waste technologies, as I assume most of us would have expected, of course. However, the fact that we in the affluent north are the ones that produce waste doesn't mean that we are the ones suffering from the consequences of it. And of course, although the Basel Convention banned the export of illegal waste, there are myriad of legal loopholes that enable these affluent countries where most e-waste is generated to export it to the poorest part of the world. And here you have research by O'Kane and Arendale where they look at all these different trading routes, illegal routes for e-waste, and you can see that the sources are mainly in the US, Europe, and the global north, all going to the south, which has become the global dump for our consumer electronics and e-waste, right? And one of the problems with e-waste is that it's particularly harmful for vulnerable communities across the world. It has huge impacts in the environmental health as well as the human health. Like e-waste is very toxic, and it has like very deeply negative consequences on the health of the local ecosystems of these, most vulnerable communities across the world, which have become the dump, the landfill, where all this e-waste is going. And it's also having really negative impacts on the actual, not only on the environmental health, but also like the physical health of these communities. So when we talk about e-waste, one of the problems that has been identified as a cause for e-waste is that we cannot, or repairing electronic products is not easy. And this is, helping to make the case for a right to repair. And there are many reasons for that. If you go to the literature, like for example, based on Persanowski, like he's got like now a new book on the right to repair, he identified different reasons why repair is today technically really difficult, but also like very expensive. I'm not going to go through all these details, but to give you an idea, for example, there are hardware restrictions on repair. For example, that could be things like difficulty to open a device. So it is very hard to open new electronic devices, and the first thing that you need to do to be able to repair something is to be able to open it without damaging it. The fact that new electronic devices come with glued components, they use special screws. So they use screws that you need very specific screwdrivers to be able to open the device. So these are in terms of, there are many other reasons. This is just a selection. There are also software restrictions. Like for example, sometimes there is a need for a specialized software that is owned by the manufacturers, so that once you repair a product, you need to initialize it. You need to activate it to make it operational. And for that, sometimes you need a specialized software that is only owned by manufacturers, right? So you might be able to repair something, but unless you run this software through it, you won't be able to use it. And the same goes for diagnosis. Sometimes you can only, like for example, think about the iPhones. Like sometimes, in order to know what's wrong with an iPhone, you need to run a software, a diagnosis software, which is again owned by the manufacturer, it's owned by Apple. There are market restrictions as well. So apart from hardware and software restrictions, you have market restrictions, like for example, high price, limited availability of spare parts. So you want a spare part and it's really expensive to accomplish. Sometimes it's more expensive, almost more expensive to buy a spare part to fix your product than buying a new one or finding a replacement. Another problem is the monopoly on repair. So some manufacturers only allow authorized repairers to fix the products. So you cannot take it to a third party. So there is not really like independent repairers being able to fix that. And so on. And then there are also like consumer norms that are also a barrier to repair. So for example, we have consumer norms that stress the importance of acquiring new products while instilling skepticism towards anything that has been repaired. So anything that has been repaired is like refurbished, is being as lower quality than something that is brand new, for example. There is also the emphasis on novelty, on conspicuous consumption, on disposability, on convenience, and so on. So when I look at this table, for me, if I only look at this, I think, okay, so the solution to this problem is to go and find all these barriers to repair and start to change them one by one. So if there are hardware restrictions, let's tackle hardware restrictions. There are software restrictions, let's tackle software restrictions. But to me, this approach is limited because it doesn't give us a clue about what is going on, and it doesn't give us, I think, the right perspective, because this is a symptom of a problem, not the problem in itself, right? So we need to understand the broader causes behind this, which are broader at a societal level, than just trying to fix, if you want to use the word, fix each of these barriers to repair individually, which will be more like a techno fix. So we need to understand the system in which these barriers to repair make sense. Because this is not about companies being evil and wanting you to pay more for products or whatever. Like, it's not necessarily that intentional, although there is a little bit of that, of course. But there is a lot of it which is systemic, right? It's systemic. So in order to do that, I really like this quote by Landon Wiener, which I think it illustrates this need to look at technology as something which is political. So Landon Wiener says that the things we call technologies are ways of building order in the world. And consciously or unconsciously, I really like the fact that, it's not necessarily like a conscious or agential here. Deliberately or inadvertently, societies choose structures for technologies that influence how people are going to work, communicate, travel, consume, and so forth over a long period of time. In the processes by which these decisions are made, different people are situated differently and possess unequal degrees of power as well as unequal levels of awareness. Right? So what this says is that, when we want to understand technology, it is not good enough to just look at the micro picture. You need to start to think about how technologies are part of this, if you want, like world building, like building order in the social world. And at the same time, technologies are being ordered by the social world themselves. So what happens when we start to think about the right to repair and the causes for product obsolescence from a bigger perspective? So in my research, I've been trying to figure out where do I start? Where do I start to make sense of these broader dynamics that, if we want to, which are not explicitly connected to the right to repair, but are related to it. And in order to do that, I've been reading around in the literature, and I found that this interconnection between three elements that are important to understand what's going on. So we have these three clogs of a machine, which connects economic growth, the view of innovation as creative destruction, and this idea of product obsolescence. I'm going to explain that next, right? But I thought, of course, this is a bit of a simplification of probably there are many other causes, but to me, this is a place to start. This is the place to start. So, the first element in that model, the first grain in the machine, is this idea of capitalism and the growth imperative. Within the degrowth and post-growth literature, there is no one uniform agreement about whether it is possible to design an ecological variety of capitalism that operates without growth. For example, you have people like a steady state economy, which are more like, I don't think they are that far from a sort of semi-capitalist kind of model, versus, for example, eco-socialist views that would say, it's not possible to have a capitalism which is not depending on constant expansion. But this is a theoretical exercise. What we know, and where there is full agreement, is that capitalism as we know it, both presently and historically, requires compound rates of economic growth to be stable. And this, by stable, I mean to be functional, to deliver employment, consumption, tax income for public services, and so on, both at the macro and micro level. So although people disagree about whether it is possible to have a different capitalism without growth, we all agree that capitalism as we know it, and capitalism as all the past experiences that we know, is completely dependent on economic growth in order to be functional, to be stable. And this is what some post-growth and degrowth scholars call the growth imperative, right? The growth imperative in capitalism. The second element in the model is this idea of innovation as creative destruction. So, when you look at what is this engine of economic growth, there are probably different explanations for it. to me, like one where I found like a close connection with this idea of the right to repair is the Schumpeterian idea of innovation as the engine of capitalism. And here you have like this, I think, nice quote, which illustrates this idea of innovation as creative destruction. So Schumpeter said that the fundamental new impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer goods, the new methods of production or transportation, the new markets, the new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprises create. And then that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old, incessantly creating the new one. And this process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. So, what is the, again, like I'm not going to spend like a lot of time, but this creative destruction in action, what does it mean in terms of technology? So, one way of thinking about it is through like the theories of the waves of innovation. So we can see like, you know, there are different ways of innovation, each one coming with different technologies in the past. So then you have like every time that there is a new wave of innovation is sort of destroying the old one and replacing it with new technologies. And something that is very interesting about that is that every new technology, because they are meant to support the pursuit of economic growth, every new wave of technological innovation is meant to increase productivity, right? So that is a sort of like the idea. So every wave of technological innovation will make our economy more productive than the previous one. So we can generate, you know, like a more output or the same amount of output with less input, or that's the idea, right? So again, what does it have to do with the repair? One of the things we know is like overproduction, and this is something that I borrow from more like the Marxist political economy. When this have like a situation where increasing productivity cannot be met by consumer demand, there is a crisis of overproduction. So the system, there is more capacity to produce in the system than the capacity of the market to absorb this production, and that creates a crisis. So this is like this moment where our ability to produce outpaces our ability to consume. So that creates, sometimes in marketing we call it market saturation. Some people talk about mature markets, but basically the idea is that it becomes increasingly harder to sell more of the same thing. And that is a problem. And it's not a new problem. And even you have people like King Camp Gillette, like the guy that invented all the disposable, and again, like we're coming back to this idea of disposability and waste. So the guy that invented the disposable razor, he had this very clear idea that overproduction is a problem. And I like this quote from the book, from Slade. It's a book on Made to Break, where he quotes a reflection made by some industrialists. I picked this one from Gillette because I thought it was particularly illuminating. So he said, referring to the situation back then, beginning of the 20th century, we have the paradox of idle men, only too anxious for work, and idle plants, in perfect conditions for production, while people are starving and frozen. It seems a bit absurd that when we have overproduced, we should go without. One would think that overproduction would result in a furious holiday and a riot of feasting and display of all superfluous goods laying around. On the contrary, overproduction produces want. Hmm? Yeah. And this idea that overproduction creates problems for capitalists is nicely illustrated in the sort of like competition between General Motors and Ford Motors at the start of the 20th century, which is where most literature situates the rise of what this thing called planned obsolescence. I don't like the word planned obsolescence because it places too much emphasis on planning on agency, on deliberation. I don't think it's that deliberate, right? As I said, I think it's systemic. But most literature that talks about planned obsolescence, they go back to this, controversy at the beginning of the century, of the 20th century, between Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan. Alfred Sloan was an engineer who became the CEO for General Motors at the time. So basically, like between 1910 and 1920, Ford had a huge market share in the automobile industry in the US. Apparently, well, based on the statistics quote in a few sources that I've checked, 55% of the American families at that time own a Ford, right? So that's basically like, one every two families had like one Ford T model at the time. General Motors at the time was a fairly marginal competitor before Alfred Sloan took ownership. Alfred Sloan was an engineer educated in MIT, and he was very influenced by reading Veblen's theories of conspicuous consumption, right? And the idea of positional goods and the search for status through consumption. So he was very influenced by these ideas, and that shaped the way he thought about the strategy to overtake Ford and become the main car manufacturer in the US in only like 10 years. So what happened? Henry Ford was a guy that, self-made engineer, like he started as an apprentice and then he grew up, and he was obsessed with a few things, but one of the things that obsessed him was durability. So he wanted that, once somebody owns one of his cars, it will be a car that will last for life. It will be durable, it will be repairable, but he wasn't very interested in other things, like choice. For example, the famous quote, you can have your 40 model in any color you like, as long as it's black, right? So he wasn't interested in colors, he wasn't interested in design, he was interested in price, durability, reliability, and the idea of one car for life. And at the time, Ford only produced one single model in one color, the 40 model, which was incredibly successful, as I said. So what did General Motors do to try to overtake Ford? So they started to experiment with a different different business model, which was more flexible, and it was about encouraging repetitive consumption. So what did they do? They started to do research and try to produce cars that came in different colors. Like they collaborated with DuPont, for example, with chemicals that could be used to provide cars in different colors that would appeal to different personalities or different tastes. They also placed a lot of emphasis on design, like working on the design, whereas Ford was not really interested in that. So he tried to make cheap cars look like the most fashionable, the most stylish cars by working on design and hiring a lot of design experts. He also promoted this idea of the electric starter. So before that, all the Ford motor cars were started with a crank, like the manivela, right? And he came up with the electric starter. Why? Because women didn't like the crank at the time, and they wanted that the car would appeal to women too. So that was his idea. He wanted women to become drivers, and for that, the electric starter was cleaner, was more efficient, and women preferred that. So he went for that, and he made this change. And another thing that he did is to start with this idea of annual car launches. So every year he would launch a new model that will only include minor variations, minimal, incremental changes, so to the previous model. But the thing is that this has a psychological effect that will make previous models look old or obsolete. So we have two completely different visions, but guess who imposed itself? It was General Motors who very quickly overtook Ford. And Henry Ford, well, it wasn't Henry Ford at the time, but the CEO who was running Ford Motors at the time, They started to adopt many of the innovations that came up from General Motors in their own production. Flexible production for a flexible public that would encourage replacement of cars rather than having a car for life. So by the time, we have the foundations of product obsolescence here. So we have psychological obsolescence, which means like a product is perceived as obsolete even though it's functional. So it's just like the perception of like the product is too old or out of fashion, whatever. Technical obsolescence, which means like it's not that a product is designed to fail, which there is a little bit of that, but it's not just that, it's that durability becomes a secondary concern. And the prime concern is other things like style or design or color or whatever. And then you have economic obsolescence, which is that when repairing a product, the cost of repairing a product or maintaining it is higher than replacing it with a new one. So we can say that, it's like Alfred Sloan, he set the foundations in General Motors at the time for what we called product obsolescence. And many of these practices are very alive today. So by the 1950s, so 20 years later, we have all the conditions in place for this problem with repair. So we have, first, from mechanics to electronics, right? Again, electronics are a lot harder to repair than mechanical products, especially from the user perspective. We have a tendency towards miniaturization and complexification of technology, lowering costs of technology proportional to disposable income, then the idea that disposability became associated with convenience, this upgrading culture, aestheticization of technology, the myth of recyclability, the idea that you just recycle something and it's completely harmless, forget about it, and you can buy something else and don't feel any kind of guilt or anything like that. So what did that mean for repair? It means repair has become increasingly difficult to perform from a technical point of view, not because manufacturers are evil, but because that is the sort of trend that imposes itself. In the designer mind, reparability is a secondary concern. So when they have to allocate resources, they put resources on improving design, on improving other characteristics, but reparability is something that always comes later. It became more expensive than ever to fix products. There is also the problem of repair being protected by very aggressive intellectual property laws and rights. And this idea that repair has become increasingly controlled by manufacturers who have access to the right repair tools, specialized repair tools, especially repair software and repair manuals. And in this context is where we are starting to have conversations about the right to repair. So in the context where we have realized that this cannot go on forever, there is a move that is not coming from radicals, but from the European Union itself, for example, where it says we need to make repair a priority because we have a huge problem with e-waste. Not only that, but also, and I'm going to talk about that later, by encouraging repair, we can contribute to the coupled economic growth from material or environmental impacts, and we can continue to this agenda of green growth in connection with the circular economy and other ideas which are similar to that. So the right to repair is an umbrella concept. There's no one right to repair. There are different demands, and that's why I say competing demands, different ways of thinking about what the right to repair should be. But in common, they have an interest in removing barriers to repair and provide consumers with viable options to repair electronic products. Its main purpose is to extend the lifespan of products and this early obsolescence, ultimately helping to fight against global e-waste. Now, okay, so this is the sort of systemic background. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to talk about what is going on in the European Union policy, at the European Union policy level. And I'm not a lawyer myself, and it's been like a real nightmare to navigate like all the sort of policy and legal issues because it's scattered, it's all over the place, there is too much information, and it's really hard to find specific regulatory proposals and the state they're at that are concerned with the right to repair, right? So it's being hard work, and I'm not sure that I'm covering everything, but I have a few starting points. At the policy level, the right to repair is explicitly referred to in 3 key policy documents. One, the European Green Deal, which is connected with the Circular Economy Action Plan, so you have these 2, and then also with the new consumer agenda for the European Union, right? So he found references to the right to repair in these 3 policy, at the policy level. That is fine, that was fairly easy. The problem is when it comes to legislation, okay? That is where things get a bit trickier. The European Parliament is clearly in favor of a right to repair. And they recently, in 2020, they approved a EU Parliament resolution supporting the right to repair, a very, very ambitious right to repair proposal in the EU resolution called Towards a More Sustainable Single Market for Businesses and Consumers, right? So the European Parliament, representing the citizens of the European Union, is clearly in favor. And the European Commission is working on proposals to try to transform these policies, which are ideally or pretending to promote the right to repair, into a specific legislation that will be applied at the EU level, right, within the EU single market. And apart from that, there are also initiatives that are supporting the right to repair at the national level. I'm going to talk about all these things next. So, for an EU-wide right to repair, I don't know, maybe some of you have already heard about this, but in March 2021, the first wave of legal or regulatory changes supporting the right to repair came through modification of the Eco-Design Directive, right? So this applies only to 4 types of consumer goods, which became like a big of a disappointment, right? It applies to washing machines, to dishwashers, to refrigerators, and to displays. And basically, this new set of eco-design rules supporting the right to repair said that manufacturers have to guarantee the availability of spare parts from 7 to 10 years after the last product has been placed in the market. Right? Now they don't have this responsibility. Oh, well, before that, now they do because of this law, but before that they didn't have this responsibility. They have a commitment to deliver spare parts within 15 days period. And they also have to make maintenance information, including repair manuals, available to professional repairers. All this looks like a positive step in the right direction. And this came into force in March 2021. But there are other things that are being proposed. Okay, these have not been agreed. Still, they are part of the legislatory process, and it can be very long before they become tangible legislative changes. For example, one of the things they want to do is to expand these new eco-design rules to other products, to mobile phones, tablets, computers, or computer servers. This is interesting. For example, for mobile phone and tablets, they are thinking about, again, this is not agreed, but the proposal is to increase the availability and frequency of damaged parts, like screens, for example, for mobile phones, increase availability of updated versions of the operating software, lower the cost of repairs, etc. For computers and servers, there are other things, increase repairability of computers, improve the lifetime of computers, and reduce the purchase of unnecessary chargers, for example. Another proposal is the Sustainable Products Initiative. The idea here is to replace the Eco-Design Directive with a more ambitious policy package, which will widen the scope of eco-design rules beyond energy-related products, right? So it could include many other products that are currently not covered by the Eco-Design Directive. As far as the right to repair is concerned, there is only two interesting proposals. One is to make manufacturers responsible for e-waste. The other one is to create a digital product passport that, from the repair perspective, will allow repairers to quickly identify spare parts. Now, this is a very difficult process, right? Sometimes to find the right part or a part that is equivalent, you need to find, it's a very complicated serial numbers and things like that. So this digital product will make that process easier. There are also proposals about changing the sales of goods directive. So, for example, like some consideration is given to giving preference to repair over replacement. So now, if you are within the legal product guarantee, which is 2 years, and you send your products, you have a faulty product, and you send it to the manufacturer, they don't have the obligation to repair it. There is something like only if it's reasonable or something like that. So very often, what they do is to give you a new product, and they will take the other one, disassemble it, and reuse it or refurbish it and send it to the second-hand market. They will also thinking about extending the period of legal guarantees for second-hand goods. Many of the products that are repaired are later sold in second-hand markets. And a problem with that is that many of them lose the guarantees or have only like a reduced guarantee. So one of the things they are thinking is about extending the guarantee after the product has been repaired, right? And even if it's sold in second-hand markets, etc. There is also this idea of modifying the Consumer Rights Directive, providing information about reparability to the consumer at the point of purchase. So every time you buy something, there should be easily identifiable information that tells you how repairable, how easy to repair is a particular electronic product. So this reparability score, for example. There is also this new batteries regulation, which is about replacing, it's going to replace the 2006 batteries directive, banning the use of glued batteries. Glued batteries are a big problem because they are really hard to disassemble and replace. So they're banning that, not for small consumer goods, but also like light means of transport. That was a very big victory for the right to repair movement, because that includes like electric scooters, for example. So they will have to come, if this proposal is approved, they will have to come with replaceable batteries, not glued batteries. So this is all for the EU-wide level. But then there are other initiatives that are at the national level. And the two most interesting initiatives supporting the right to repair are in France and Austria at the moment. So in France, for example, I don't know whether you knew about that, they launched a reparability index, which goes from 1 to 10, where manufacturers is full of problems, right? So it's not a panacea. I don't want to go into the detail here. It's full of problems. But the reparability index basically applies to 5 categories, and it basically is an index, it's a label that tells you from 1 to 10, 1 being very not repairable, 10 being like easily repairable. It tells you how repairable the product is. And it only applies for smartphones, washing machines, TVs, lawn mowers, and laptops. And in Austria, very recently, they launched a new repair bonus, which basically means that it's a scheme whereby the government will refund you 50% of the cost of repair, as long as it's up to an amount of 200 euros, right? So if you take something to repair, and it costs you 500 euros to fix it, the government will refund you 50% of that, as long as it's no more than 200 euros. So these are initiatives to encourage repair. Right, so the final part of my presentation is the critique, okay? So the problem with criticizing the right to repair is that when you criticize the right to repair, it looks like you are against the right to repair. I'm not against the right to repair. And it's like a problem when you criticize ideas that come with this very strong moral force, like sustainable development or circular economy. It looks like you are against it. But again, my critique of the right to repair is not that I'm against the right to repair. It's that I think there are caveats and problems with the right to repair as is currently being formulated in my study of European regulation and policy, and that needs to be addressed. But this critique, because this is a very early stage of my research, is just work in progress. It might be completely wrong here, and I can be proved wrong, but this is more like a working hypothesis at the moment. So I've been doing this for a few months only, right? So I have 4 critiques. One is repair as possibly becoming the next commodity frontier for capitalist assetization. I'm going to explain that later. The right to repair as being conceived as a technocratic endeavor. The third critique I'm going to present is the right to repair as being framed only as a consumer right. And finally, is the right to repair as being conceived as supporting the pursuit of green economic growth. So starting with the idea of assetization. So to make this critique, I draw on assetization theory by Bertrand Muniesa. It comes from science and technology studies. So basically, what they argue is that the dominant form in contemporary techno-scientific capitalism is not the commodity, but the asset. I'm going to explain what the asset is after that. So by these authors, am I going too fast, by the way? Or, so you're taking notes, maybe So an asset is defined as anything that can be owned, controlled, traded, and capitalized as a constant, that is the key, as a constant revenue stream. So the point that these authors make is that assetization enables a shifting accumulation strategy, whereby the goal is not to profit from selling commodities, but rather the idea is to profit or to capitalize on the durable economic rent that we can extract from these commodities. Example is ideas surrounded, for example, servitization, access-based consumption. Think about Uber, think about social media, media streaming platforms, or think about, for example, Office, Microsoft Office. You know, in the past, you used to buy Microsoft Office as a package, install it in your laptop, and it was yours. Now you pay per access. So, you know, we could say that it has moved from being a commodity to being an asset, which provides Microsoft with a constant stream of revenue. So it's about rent seeking rather than selling products, and the product become a vehicle to extract a perpetual rent from the user. And this is often being framed in very positive terms like servitization, access-based consumption, etc., etc. But there is a problem here, which is that it can be a very highly exploitative accumulation strategy. So how can I apply this to repair? Again, hypothetically, corporations may seek to capture value through repair. So the right to repair, so if we oblige corporations to repair, but we give them the monopoly of the means of repairing, they can turn repair into an asset. And by limiting, for example, third-party repairs or self-repair. So you can only repair something if it goes to an authorized repairer, and the authorized repairer is controlled by them. The monopoly on spare parts, for example, I don't know, that making them unnecessarily expensive. Think about a door handle for a meal fridge. It costs 200. It's plastic door handle, 200 euros. Control of repair software. I think about John Deere, for example. If you repair a John Deere tractor, initially you couldn't, but the farmers won the legal battle recently, and now it is authorized that a third-party repairer can fix a John Deere tractor. The problem is that they don't have the initializing software. So once you install a new part in the tractor, you need a software to activate it, and that is owned by the brand. So they charge a flat fee of 190 euros for initializing, and then 100 per hours of the technician labor or whatever. Again, another stream of revenue. They also control of authorized repairers. So maybe they charge fees for licensing who can repair a product, for training the staff, for providing the tools, etc. Right? So the point is that repair becomes the asset. Another accumulation and extractive strategy rather than something that is done for the user to be able to have easy access to repair. Another problem is the idea of repair being conceived as a technocratic endeavor. So if we allow manufacturers to monopolize the right to repair, I repeat, I'm not against the right to repair. I'm thinking about monopolizing the right to repair by big manufacturers. The problem is that it doesn't challenge anything, it doesn't challenge our increasing dependence on global socio-technical systems governing everyday life, which is part of the problem, as we show earlier in the talk. And in fact, the opposite might be true. We might become more dependent on it than ever. Because we not only need them for buying the products that they are selling us, but also we need them to fix these products after they sell them to us. Another criticism I am working on is this problem of framing repair in very narrow terms as a consumer right. So if you look at the policy and all the discourse in the European Union surrounding the right to repair, basically this is a consumer right. And the problem with consumer rights, because all the emphasis is placed on issues such as money saving, giving consumers have the right to repair their own things they own, quality assurances, extending product guarantees, etc. But the problem with just focusing on this and missing the bigger picture, which I mentioned earlier, is that it depoliticizes the right to repair. And the right to repair initially, as conceived by right to repair activists, is a very political approach. It's not only about repair. It's about changing the relationship between people and technology manufacturers. And the final criticism I've got against the right to repair is that currently in the European Union, the right to repair is clearly, explicitly defined as supportive of the circular economy, which is itself seen as an industrial strategy for green growth. In a nutshell, very blunt, very brief summary of what green growth is, we could define green growth as the premise that green technologies, environmentally oriented consumers, and business models can radically decouple economic outputs from environmental impacts, right? Carbon emissions, waste, in this case waste or whatever. But if we look at the literature, there is a problem with decoupling. Like you have Whitman et al., for example, recently published this paper in, well, not recently, 2020, Nature Communications, where they show that although there has been some decoupling, just so you look at the orange line is the global GDP, gross domestic product. The purple line is the global raw material extraction, and the dotted line in green is the global carbon emissions. So you can see like there has been some decoupling from carbon emissions, but definitely not decoupling at all when it comes to resource extraction, which is what the right to repair is really trying to, one of the things that the right to repair is trying to solve, right? So again, problematic. Another problem with that is the so-called Jevons paradox, the rebound effect. In a nutshell, it means like the rebound effect says that sometimes when we make policies or measures that are focused on improving efficiency, sometimes we can achieve the opposite effect and it might backfire, right? So for example, like I don't know, like you try to tackle the problem of carbon emissions by building more efficient engines for car, that makes the price of driving the car, lowers the price of driving a car, and this means like, either people drive more, and therefore they offset the gains that we have from the efficiency gains that we did before. Either they drive more because it's cheaper, or they save money and spend it on going on holidays somewhere else, like to whatever, like, which again like increases the damage, right, indirectly. So I'm thinking that the same could happen with repair. If you based the whole rationale of repair on green growth, and you say, like, you tell consumers that you're going to save a lot of money by repairing things rather than buying new ones, maybe they will use this spare money to buy more electronics or to do other things that have a more detrimental impact, again, on the environment. So there is a risk here that unless the right to repair is combined with a sufficient strategy, it could be the same, and I always make this analogy, as telling people to go on a diet if they want to lose weight, and working out in the gym in order to lose weight, and then like going home and eating like everything like fries and junk food and whatever. So we need to combine these two things, like a focus on efficiency with a focus on sufficiency. And this applies to the right to repair. So the right to repair might thus unwittingly, so I'm not saying this is intentional, but inadvertently maintain rather than transform existing society technology relationships that are organized around growth. So unless we ask ourselves the question about what the right to repair might look like from a post-growth perspective, which is what I'm planning to do in the next couple of years, okay? So I haven't got an answer for that. But I think we can learn a lot from right to repair activists. So the right to repair originally started not as a policy by the European Union, but as a grassroots movement trying to address the problem with planned obsolescence, and e-waste. So the next part of my research is going to talk with activists and the right to repair movement to try to figure out what are their views on what they think the right to repair should be in the European Union. And after that, I'm going to look at these policy activist views from post-growth and degrowth literature to try to come up with a more specific framing that we could return as an alternative to the current propositions on the right to repair. So, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions or feedback or comments, I'm happy to take them now.
Well, Javier, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very inspiring, actually. I wanted to ask you, do we have any evidence about the short-term effects of this change in the directive? That means, I've been thinking a lot while you presented. I know about the statistics or statistical sources for cars. I can find how many cars have been sold in Spain and so on and so forth. But do you know how many washing machines have been repaired, or do we have statistics on that? Mm-hmm. So we can assess the impact. Mm-hmm. Because I think we are also short on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think, you mean in terms of the EU directive, the eco-design directive, the recently approved one? I think so far I haven't seen anything on that. I know, and another thing that I think is very important from the point of view of economists and statistics, I think one work that desperately needs to be done is to talk about the replacement rates and how they have changed historically for different product categories. I think that that is definitely something that needs to be done, because when you're looking at, I don't know, the data for how often products are replaced, you find often it's either very recent or there is not much data at all. So although we all have a sense that we are buying more stuff recently, or that things or the durability of certain products has decreased over time, I haven't found really solid, statistical data showing the historical trends for specific product categories. And I think that job is something that is desperately needed. Maybe there is, maybe I haven't seen it. But I think I would like to see studies of looking at how this durability of products has evolved historically for, I don't know, cars or mobile phone. I mean, I've seen something, but often the studies don't look at very big periods of time. It looks quite small. So I think that's something that needs to be done.
I agree. I think we are missing data in terms of assessing impact of that and many other aspects of green growth. But we are certainly missing data on repairs, right? Mm-hmm. Not only sales, not first-time sales, but repairs. We don't have data on that, as far as I know.
Yeah. And durability, I think.
Yeah.
And durability.
So I leave the floor open, also given that my connection is not good today. So thank you so much, Javier. We will talk in another moment. And I leave the floor open for questions. So please, guys, go ahead and interact between each of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Are there questions in the room?
Yeah. Should we start with the room and then move to online?
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. A lot of things to digest. It was really interesting points. So I have a couple of questions. So the first one is about the first part of your work. So you're gonna work about policy. When working on policy, will you focus on organizations and on production, but would you focus as well on the consumption side? Do you want me to do all the questions, or?
Okay, clarify this one because I'm not
Okay.
sure what you're asking.
So, for example, when looking at policies, are you going to focus on policies that try to focus on eco-design, repairability on companies, or are you going to work as well on policies that aim to promote reduction on consumption, for example?
I'm going to focus on policies that promote the right to repair, either by promoting changes on design, but also giving consumers incentives, or even like, I haven't seen anything about changing social norms, for example, but that would be good. So anything that is directly related to right to repair. When it comes to, I think your question is related to the post-growth analysis, right? So how am I going to bring in the post-growth idea? And the post-growth part is not going to come from policy, but it's going to come from literature. Like a literature on post-growth and theory. So I'm going to analyze policies, proposals, through these lenses.
Okay. The second one is if you want to focus on specific industry, or if you want to do like a more general analysis on the right to repair.
Yeah, that's a good question. At the moment, I'm looking at what the European Union is doing, and the European Union is working on different proposals, and each as I saw, that there are different modifications of EU directives for different things. So some of them are not, many of them are not industry specific, they are product specific, which makes it even worse. So my point is not to provide a very in-depth analysis of each of them, just to have an overview of what is being promoted and from the top down, from the EU level, in terms of how the EU thinks about the right to repair, and compare it with the grassroots organizations.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And the last one is about assetization. Like I really like this point because it really makes the difference, especially when trying to do a critique from post-growth. Because if you don't have a look on the social dimension, on the economic side of these proposals, no, you can have on the one hand, for example, if we take the case of car sharing, for example, so we can have on the one hand like a model where rent is completely concentrated on car manufacturers that are already oligopoly and that have alliances between oligopolies, or at the same time with a different organizational form, or you can have like cars that are collectively owned by users, and then within the organization they promote a reduction on transport, which will be completely different lenses, no?
But I agree with that, but I think that my focus is not on car ownership, but repair.
Yes.
So the assetization is not assetization of the car, which is one thing, but the assetization of repair. So the point where repair becomes an asset. So I would be interested in organizations where repair is not assetized. It's not assetized. So they will actually, they are trying to make it more democratic. But I can't, if I know your question because it's very important, but if I focus on car ownership, it becomes too broad.
Yeah, that was a bad example. Yeah.
So I want to narrow down to repair only. But yeah, it's very important that. But I cannot do everything, and that's why I think I'll focus on repair only.
And just a last comment, like what could be interesting as well, like focusing on a repairing example, on this kind of grassroots organizations or repair workshops, or what it could be interesting to explore as well is the subjectivation of consumers when engaging with repairing, like in a more personal level instead of just doing a delegation.
Yeah, that's very important, and that's why I say one of my criticism of the right to repair is the problem that is being framed as a consumer right, when I think it should be it's a citizen right. But that's exactly that's my idea. Again, I haven't done my research, so I can't tell you I think that this is the case, but that's what I'm hoping to find.
I think, is it working? I think you just partially answered my question, but thank you very much. I'm perpetually super gluing my headphones, so this is a problem for me too. I just wondered whom you were going to see investigate as your activists doing repair.
Yeah, I'm thinking about there's an organization which is which is advocating for the right to repair in the European Union, which is a conglomerate of different organizations, from repair cafes, the repair activists, and there are also like some businesses as well that are trying to push for a more radical, more ambitious right to repair, and so there is a coalition there which can be identified. How am I going to get access to it? I don't know. I hope I can, because I'm very interested in their views, and I think their views are very important, and I want their views to be reflected in my research, because I think the right to repair is not what the European Union says. The right to repair can be other things, and in order to have these other views, I think we need to hear the voices of the activists.
Thank you, Javier, for being here. Very insightful presentation about these new things. And I have first one question. You talked about psychological obsolescence and the search for status. And I wanted to know if there was another driver other than the status for this psychological obsolescence. And second is question/comment. That is, you talked about that as of now, how the right to repair is framed could lead to a monopoly, right? I mean, totally agree with that. But let me play the advocate's devil role. But why is not this good? For instance, why is not this good to create a monopoly? Of course, there is a loss of consumer value, the value they can appropriate. But at the end, if you see in any economics 101 oligopolistic analysis, the output reduces, you could legislate better over these monopolies. So what's your take on this?
I think the question about why, I know, I mean, it's a provocative question, because I think like it's hard to, I think to me, like, this is a moral question, because the right to repair is not like, it's like why is democracy good? You know, like if we could do things more efficiently, but it's a question of values, right? The right to repair, as was originally formulated, is not just about improving access to repair. It's about changing the relationship between people and technology, and between people and the manufacturers of technology. So this is why I think it's very important to avoid monopolies. You could argue, and I agree with you, that if you have a monopoly and your representatives, the representatives of the people, can regulate that, indirectly you are having this the same effect. But we know that the real life is not like that, and we know that there is not a disconnection between politics and big businesses and corporations. So it's about power imbalances. So I think a more democratic right to repair can challenge that by breaking these monopolies, especially by opening it up not only for people to do it yourself repair, but also like independent repairers as well. So I'm not saying like everyone should be able to fix an iPhone, but I'm saying it's like it cannot become a rent-seeking asset for corporations that will entrench in their current positions of power. Because if it is that, it's about that, it's not going to change anything. It's very conservative. But yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, so I thoroughly enjoyed your talk, and it was very insightful, and I agree with most of your points. But along with that, I have certain comments and maybe one or two questions. So first of all, as you have explained that how it has shifted, how earlier, like in terms of capitalism, how it was about earning profit from the product, and now how it has become about earning profit from the services. So it's again like the different style of or different variety of capitalism, like how from Ford to General Motor, and how nowadays like it has moved to a separate category. Like even in India, like in Bangalore, like especially now new startups are coming which are not trying to earn profit from the product, but they are now trying to profit from the services. So they are, like for instance, in the water sector, they are not selling products, they are selling services. So they will install water purifier and they will guarantee that everything will be taken care by them. So it's all about services.
Yeah, it's the same.
So in that context, like my question was more about, so from the European perspective, what I can see and what I can reflect on, it is more about the idea of green growth and however it is defined. So it's all about the capitalist relationship between the manufacturer and the regulator, and the regulator is the state. So they are talking about responsible production, responsible consumption, but they are not talking about radically challenging the relationship between the manufacturer and the consumer. So in a very limited frame, they are talking about changing the relationship. But when we will talk about the relationship between the manufacturer and the user, then it will also require so many other aspects, because and that will require more historicization of this whole context. Like the European Union as a context, how it has moved from like different small players to monopoly and oligopoly, and how the space for the repair has shrinked, how it has gone away from the everyday life, and along with that the cultural shift. So this will, like, the work will require more historicization in that way, like how in a capitalist economy things have changed. And now from the post-growth perspective, what new radical relationships can be possible and how can that be made possible? For instance, like if we talk about India, so there is, even with all these capitalist forces and the move towards capitalization, capitalism or a particular kind of capitalism, there is still space for informal economy. And there is still a lot of unregulated market. So again, if we talk about India and consumer electronic products, then a lot of products come from China, and they are compatible products. So even though if you go to a station, they will only ask you, repair means replacement. So repair doesn't mean that you repair the product, you just replace, and that is the idea of repairing the product. But if there is compatible product available, and in the global south, compatible products are available, and China is definitely like one of the big players. So when you will be historicizing these debates, maybe like it would be very interesting to see the relationship, how China has emerged as a player, and how the relationship between the manufacturer and the regulatory state will change in that context. So there is a space where compatible products are available, but I'm not sure about like European Union, because the market works very differently in European Union. Like maybe the market is more regulated, there is less access for regulatory compatible products. So that is one question or comment maybe. And broadly, so the another thing is about informality.
About, sorry?
Informality. So whatever you are talking, it is more in terms of formal, like how the regulatory state and the manufacturer will deal with each other. And in the green growth, it is more about that. But well, will there be informal spaces, like intermediary actors, those who will have more space in the real world situation? Because you will need like informal spaces or smaller firms who will be building or manufacturing these like some of these smaller products. Because if everything is built by the manufacturer themselves, then obviously there will be no choice. So maybe the question of informality, the question of the and in case of China, the sector will become important, because if you talk about electronics, then maybe China will come as a big player. In case of like solar photovoltaic, maybe they will come as a big player, but not maybe exactly in the same way in automobile. So every sector will have its own way to deal with repair, the question of repair and the relationship. And the third question is obviously about the idea of environmental imperatives. So in this case, like how the idea of green growth has been used to, how you are using that, how the idea of repair can be promoted by using the idea of green growth. But in context like India, many times like repair, the right to repair or the idea of repair is being criticized from the perspective of environment. because people will say that like if you will repair, the product will be not as environment friendly as if you replace it. So it's all about efficiency. Efficiency defined in terms of environment, environmental efficiency. So the new products are always environmentally more efficient than the older products, than the repaired products. So maybe these questions you will.
I mean, they are good. They're all good points. I haven't got answers to them because it's just like, you know, it really broadens this again. I don't think I can do everything. I think these are things that are important. For example, it made me think that usually, like by professional like default, I tend to take the side of consumption rather than production, right? Like, you know, I come from marketing, so, you know, usually starting with where these products are consumed, not where they are produced. So you make all these points about context as well. Definitely, I'm not sure how far I can take them, but they're all fair comments, and yeah, I take them on board.
Maybe, I don't know if you're considering that, you might already be considering that, is thinking about people who subvert the system, like who cannot be so formally part of the right to repair because their livelihood depends on not taking an ideological position. And I'm again coming from an Indian perspective because people are dependent on things on a very everyday basis and they cannot like stand ideologically opposed to big things. So, but they find ways to tinker with the system. And we call this term as jugaad, which is very, very popular. It's like you do not confront it directly, but you find ways to manipulate it in some ways. And these people might not come forward when you start talking about right to repair as an ideological position, but then finding ways to engage with things. So maybe the third category.
No, I agree. And you know, we are not inventing the right to repair. The right to repair was invented the moment, like, you know, someone made something and fixed it. So I think the right to repair, as I agree with you, is an ideological position. That's why I think it's an ideological position that cannot be depoliticized. But this doesn't mean that the right to repair captures every single dynamic that is going on in the system. So again, like, I totally agree with it. Like, it's not meant to mean everything. It's a very specific word, yeah.
Okay, we can continue over few drinks here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.